When creating chart or intake form templates, just a few key things to note when you're creating them. So to start, you would go into your settings using your cog off to the left, and from here under forms and letters, you would be able to do an intake form or chart template. When creating them, be aware that a chart template is something that is accessible by practitioners and administrators if assigned to their profile, and can only be filled out within the charting tab of a patient's, or within the patient's profile. The intake form, however, can be fillable by a patient. You can either email it individually, or you can grant them access to the patient portal, and if it is turned on there, patients can fill in those intake forms. Intake forms are typically only fillable once. Once they are completed, then they will remain on the patient's profile under their intake tab. The ability to reuse the form only works if you export the original copy to save to their documents, and then you would basically delete the current copy in the system, and then you can reissue that form to be done again. When you are creating either a chart or a template, these are just a few tricks and tips to help you along the way. So if you were creating an intake template or a chart template, for this example, we'll use it as an intake form. You would put in a name for all three of them. You do want to make sure that all three lines are filled in. This makes it viewable either in the patient's profile, in the charting tab, as well as on the patient, or in the patient portal as well. So here you would update the settings. When you are starting, you will always start with a new category, and you will always start with a new row. So in the category, this is what you would list, you know, if, for example, if we're creating a health history, you can put in health history or demographic, anything like that you can fill in here. Basically, it's the label to what you are creating in this subsection. From here, you basically have a row, in which case you can put any type of these elements in there. The few things to note here is you do want to work with rows and columns versus putting everything just into one row. So here you would use your wrench to add additional columns. You can only put in a max of 10 columns. At a minimum, my recommendation is to always run at least 2, even if you're only putting in a single line or a single label or input, is always to have an end column. This just helps the system recognize where the end of the page should be, especially when you've got a multi-line text label, or you've got an image or a multi-line text input. This just kind of gives it a bit more structure. So once you've got your columns in there, you would basically use any one of these inputs on what you would like to do. So a checkbox input is literally just that. It's a checkbox for a patient to fill in. So you would select it, drag and drop it. From here, you would double click, and here you could put in whatever element title you would like. Once again, my recommendation is always to add in extra spaces. It just formats and reads a little nicer. So I always put an extra space before or after the checkbox, just to make sure that it's a little clearer. It doesn't get as crunched when you're looking at the form in the rest of the system or in the patient profile. So here I can put in, say, for example, using how they would like to be addressed, Miss, Mrs., Mr., anything like that. Here you can either remove the label altogether, or you can make sure that the label goes before the checkbox or after the checkbox. So here I'll leave it as after. And so from here, now the patient would be able to check it off that they would prefer to be addressed as Miss. The next one that you would have an option for is a radio button template. Now, the radio button template is different than your checkbox in that these are sequential. So you can create multiple radio buttons for those options where you only want a patient or a practitioner to be able to select one of the options. So for example, like a pain scale of 1 to 10 type of thing. So you would go in and you would do the same thing you would with the checkbox. You would put in, say, you know, maybe it's the number, you can put it before or after, and then here you're going to group with. This is what becomes key if you've got multiple radio buttons or multiple elements like this within it. So for example, if I've got, let's say this one here on a scale of 1 to 10, and I would put in my different element titles, and I could have them going all the way across to 10. So here I would have those in there. And then if I wanted and I needed to create another one somewhere in the form, either right below it or maybe further down, when I'm creating a new row and I'm putting in the radio button, the key thing is to make sure that you're grouping them differently. So as you can see, as soon as I drop in another radio button and I double click it, it automatically groups it with the original one. So here, this is a whole different radio group. I do not need them to link in with this one. So when I'm creating the labels here, I'm going to add in a number or a letter or some sort of sequence that will now group the next cluster of radio buttons together. So typically I just throw in one, and then if I do another one, it's two, etc., etc. So from here, I've now I've changed the sequence. So when I double click on these ones, it's only going to group these two together. And when I double click on this one, it will only group this one and any others that I keep within this group together as well. So same thing, for example, let's say I'm going to copy or I'm going to create another one from here. I can quickly create a new row just by clicking on the copy button, and it creates a new row right below it. This is a great feature when you do have multiple columns and you're looking to make them align properly and so they format nicely when a patient's filling it in or a practitioner's filling it in. But here now I've created a third grouping of radio buttons, so I want to double click that, and here I would change that number from 1 to 2. So now when I double click, it will only keep them sequentially with this group, and when I double click this one, it will only keep it with that group as well. So be aware that radio buttons, you do need to make sure that your sequences and your groups are constantly updated. Otherwise, when a patient or a practitioner fills it in, you are going to find that the buttons will float around the form. Radio buttons, I honestly recommend only when you absolutely must have only one answer in a sequence. You know, usually, like I said, a pain scale 0 to 10, you only want the patient to answer one or one number within there, as opposed to checking off multiple boxes if you use the checkbox feature. The next one that you have is a single line text box, or input. So what this does is it gives the opportunity for a limited character fill-in box. So for example, if I put that in here and I go patient name. So the one thing to watch for on this is that you want to watch your width. This element input width is how many characters you would like the person to fill in. At a maximum, you want 100, but let's say a patient name typically is somewhere around 40 characters. So it will give them the right amount of space. If you do not fill in the input width and you leave that at that 0, it will automatically default to 20. So if you need 20 or less, you don't need to fill in the width, but if you need it to be bigger, then you're going to want to update this input width to however many characters you want them to be allowed to fill in. And typically, same thing, you'll want to do it before or after. So in this case, I would like, you know, the label to be before the fill-in box from here. So this you can put in for patient names, date of birth, addresses, that kind of thing. Just watch that element input width. The next one that you would have an option for is your multi-line text input. So this is where if you want to give the option to a patient or a practitioner for them to fill in however many characters. There's no character limitations on this. They can fill in as much information or as little information as necessary. It does give you the option to put in a label where you can put in, you know, notes or something like that. My recommendation, just for formatting purposes, I don't typically use the label and I will remove it. If I need to have a label for this text box, then what I will do is I'll actually put in a single line text label. And this way it formats and it will put the text above the box. So here I would put, say for example, notes, and I would save that. And now when I'm looking at the form in either the chart or the intake, it's going to have notes and then the box will be below it. If you decide to use the element title within here and you put it before or after, that notes label will now come to the side and it will push and squish the box off. So if you have multiple ones like that, depending on however many characters, it does kind of sometimes cause a little bit of a zigzag down in your list. This way it keeps it formatted and it keeps it neat and clean. The last option that you have is the ability to put in a select box. So this is if you had a drop down arrow for a patient or a practitioner to fill in. So for example, in the select box, instead of doing the check boxes for titles, I could absolutely go in and offer this as a select box input. So I could double click it here. I can put in my, my title. So how they would like to be addressed, right? I can have it before or after. I can also create no label on here. And then I can add in as many options as I would like. Typically, I always put one in here for select as opposed to leaving it blank, because sometimes people will, especially if you don't have a label, they just kind of ignore it. Here it lets them know, it just gives direction that they need to select it, and then you can put in whatever things you want here. The other thing that I typically do is I'll actually add in extra spaces here. Anytime I put text in, I will always add an extra space, at least at the end of all text input. Once again, it just keeps things clean and aligns everything and formats it nicely. And when you have a select box or the check box or even the radio buttons, I always put a space before and a space after. For the single line text input, I usually just put a space after the text if the box is after it, or I'll put a space before the text if the text is after the box. So here I've got this in, and then I update it. So now when a patient's looking at this on the form, or a practitioner, they'll see this, they'll be able to select that drop down and it will give them all of the options. This is a great feature when you're doing date of birth as well. You can do months, you can do provinces, days, that kind of thing. I do not recommend it for years, just otherwise you would be creating basically up to 100 options, as we do have some people that live up to 100 now. So I would put this maybe for a month and date, but then I would leave a small single line text input to fill in the birth year. More often than not, I'll use just a single one here that just says DOB. So these are your input elements where basically you're wanting whomever, practitioner or patient, to fill something in or check a box off, you know, making sure that they're actively participating in the completion of this form. Your label elements, however, are more where you're going to put that information. So if you're putting in instructions on how to complete a form, or if you've got an index that you want them to and you need to put in directions or how they should be filling it in, this is where you're going to want to use either the multi-line text label or the single line text label. So the multi-line text label works pretty much the same as a multi-line text input in that there is no character restrictions. You can put in an entire life story in here if you would like. Basically, you would just copy whatever from whatever form that you would have, and then you would paste in here, and you would basically put it all in. Now, just be aware that there are certain texts and symbols that do not work or don't currently format with the intake and chart feature. So for example, the ampersand or the and sign, if you do put that in there, you are going to get a misread on the code, and it will cause it to be a little bit different. You will want to remove those and put those in as ands. Greater than, less than symbols as well currently are not formatted very well for the inputs. So same thing, you'll want to basically spell those out in your text as well. This is an updated feature that is coming with our revamp and revitalization for our intake and chart forms. So in the future, this will be something, those symbols will not be an issue. But right now, just be prepared that if you do put in symbols, so for example, if I put in the ampersand, when I go to export this into a PDF, I am going to get a misread on the code, and I will show you what that looks like. The next one that you have is basically the single line text input. So this here is just more limited character, just like your single line input. So basically, if I'm putting the label or the text in here, basically I can put in, you typically want to keep this to shorter sentences. I recommend usually 100 characters or less using a single line. More often than not, I'll use multi-line for just about any text that I put in there, because then I never have to worry about where my character count is. So even if it's a short sentence, I'll often use the multi-line text label as well. Here it does give you the option for the element style where you can align left, right, center, or justify. I am going to warn you right now, doesn't matter which feature you do, it will automatically default to the left. So whether you correct that or not, it will align everything to the left side of the page. If you are looking to center something, so if you wanted basically a title line, for example, then this is where you would play around with your columns. So here you would kind of put in a single line text label, and then you would put this as, you know, title page. or whatever like label you'd like to put in there. Now, to be aware, when you are looking at screens like this, on my screen right now, it is a large screen, so everything's spread out quite large. Depending on the screen that you're working with, you can create these on, I've created them on cell phones, so you are able to use any type of screen size. Just be aware that obviously formatting will always be an issue. But typically when you're working with this little dash here right in the middle is about the middle of your page. So if I'm looking to make this about the middle of my page to label it, then I'll put it somewhere in this little, by this little dash here on the line. Same thing when you're formatting your columns. So I've put in my elements, I've put in my labels. Now I want to format and make sure that it lines up very nicely. So the more columns that you have, the more you want to watch where you're putting everything. So here, this actually will align everything perfectly when you've got a 10, but let's say I want 4 check boxes for patients to fill in as part of their history. So then I'm going to want to make sure that they line up nicely. I always keep that one end column, so while I need 4 columns, I'll always put 1 extra at a 5, and then I just move it right to the end. So it's out of my way. And then basically I'm going to format the rest of my columns here. So if this is about my halfway page, then I'm going to make sure that my middle one is going to be right about there. And then I will align these ones to kind of line up a bit more. So here I've got about 4 equal parts, so that when I'm putting in those check boxes, when they format on the page, they will align quite nicely. And then same thing, so if I've got multiple check boxes, say for example a health history where I've got multiple conditions that I want a patient to check off, the easiest way to do it is actually to create one row and then copy them so that you have them, they all align perfectly. You don't have to worry about lining everything up. And then basically I can just go in and I can copy and paste whatever issues that or whatever titles I would like in there. And then, or like I said, copy and paste from if you've got yourself a PDF or Word document of your original or your paper copy. So here, copy and paste really quick in there, and I've got them all in. Like I said, they're all aligned very nicely. So just be aware that the more rows and columns, the more columns that you have, the tighter things are going to become within there. And so you want to watch your spacing very carefully. The more text that you have in here, especially on a checkbox, which will not move it to a second line, it will just bleed into the next one. So if you have more text here, you're going to want to have less rows. So if it's a large chunk of selection, then you're going to want to do things a little bit differently. So for example, if I've got indexes, for example, typically sometimes we'll have a great deal of text for a selection. So if I'm creating something like that, I will typically only put in 2. Not typically 2. I'll actually create a single or a checkbox basically column that has no label, and then I will put in a multi-line text here. And then if I'm doing it more than one, let's say I'm doing, you know, say 2 options to each one, then I will create the same thing here. And then this way, it still gives the patient or the practitioner the option to select the checkbox, but gives you plenty of space to put in the text that you have. And with the text labels, you would basically be able to copy and paste large amounts of text, which will automatically, you know, box itself, and it'll bring it down into next lines until all the text is in there. Versus a checkbox here, you want to keep these for shorter options, shorter text. And then that way they don't bleed into the next one. So that would be a good option for any of those indexes or anything where you've got large chunks of text that you want to make sure that are there, and then still give them the option to check off the box off to the side. Once again, it just keeps everything aligned nicely as well. Nothing kind of flies off the page or, you know, runs over into something else. So for example, if I have these 2 close together, because it seems like that would be enough space, when I save the form and then I want to preview it into a PDF, you'll see that it automatically bleeds into that next page. Or into that next option. So this is why you want to make sure that you have enough space on each one of them to give room for the text to fill in. The other thing is when you're exporting it, anytime you have the ampersand, this is the code that will come up in there. So of course it doesn't look the way that the text should. So this is why you want to make sure that you don't use an ampersand, but that you actually use the word and. At least until we have that updated, which is coming soon. So once again here, you want to make sure that you've got those spaced out. Right, and you can see that they're relatively aligned there. And then if I change this to and, once I export it out to the PDF again, now it comes in proper, and here you can see that you have enough space, and there is actually extra room if you need to. So basically you kind of want to look at each one as maybe a block of no more than 20-25 characters if you're doing it in 4s, and basically just take 100 and divide it by however many rows that you decide to put in there, and that's the amount of characters that you want in each row. So these are just a few tips and tricks in creating chart templates or intake templates as well. Once you have everything created on the form and you've got it looking the way that you want, you've tested it out in the preview export to PDF, you've saved the form multiple times, I recommend doing it no matter how large the form is. Just constantly update and save. It just makes sure that if your computer crashes or the internet crashes, you don't lose all of the work that you've had. Once you are done and everything is exactly the way that you would like it, now you need to publish the form. And this is a key step. Until you publish it to the system, you cannot find it in the intake forms, nor can you find it in the chart options within the practitioner or administrator's profile. So once I go in here, I can go in, I can publish the form. It's going to take a moment, and then it will tell me that it is successfully published. Now, if I'd like to, I can go into, in this case it was an intake, so if I go into any patient's profile, under the intake tab, I will now be able to email that intake form, or I will be able to, my apologies for the intake form, there is one additional step before that they are visible in the patient's profile. Once you have completed it and published, you need to go back into your intake form and chart templates, and under the intake form defaults, this is where you actually activate it within the system. So here you can activate it so it is only visible on your side of the Juvonno program, so in the patient's profile where you can email it out. If you would like this form to be accessible online as well, then you would be able to show it in the portal. So from here I can now save it. Now when I go into a patient's profile, under that intake tab, I will find that chart here. And so from here, I can either begin the intake form with the patient, and this is where you can also see how it formats for them on the screen. As you can see, because I did not put a space or a column between the 0 and 1, they have crunched together. This is why it's very important that you do put in as many columns as you possibly can, regardless of how many features that you have. It just aligns and formats nicely. So from here you can see that, see what it is, you can fill it out with the patient, or this is how the patient will see it if they go into the patient's profile, or when you intake it, or pardon me, email the intake to them as well. If it is a chart template for you to be able to test it out and see how it looks when you're charting, then basically you would go into your profile under charts and you would be able to add in at the top under chart templates. Any customized charts that you have created will show up first. System built ones will always show up at the bottom. So if I had any that were chart templates, they would show up here. I'd be able to select it, and then I can test it out in the patient's profile. Now, in the event that I go in and I test it out on the profile and I find, oh, there's some things that doesn't look right. Like I said, when I looked at those radio buttons, it was really crunched together. So here I want to make sure that I'm adding in another column. I want to make sure there's a better spacing with them, between them. So I would go in and I'd add this. I'd have to save the form. The next step that I would have to do is I would need to republish that form. Anytime there is a change or a modification to a chart or intake form, you will need to save it and you will need to republish that form. So once I've published it again, those updates when I go into the patient's profile will now show up when I look at those intake forms. So now you can see it, the spacing is much better, and the patient would be able to select from here. Once you have completed and you've started using these forms for your patients' profiles or for their intakes or for charting, if you decide to do an update to an intake at a future time, or you need to add something in because maybe a college or association requirement has changed, I do not recommend just modifying a current one. I actually recommend cloning it into a second version. This makes sure that you can see that differentiation within the system and patient profiles. In this event as well, it actually will then re-establish and create a new form for a patient to fill in online. Whereas if you make a modification on a previously filled in form, the changes will not update in there for a patient to fill in. They will still only see the older version of it. So from here, if I needed to, I would just select the form I'm looking to. I'd clone this, and basically I would just create this as a second version. And then I can make whatever changes that I need to on this form here. Maybe it's corrections here, or I need to add in a new option or feature, you know, especially as we've changed. Gender seems to be one that needs to have that update more frequently right now. So here you would be able to go in and you could offer all of those different options, say with a select box or with check boxes. But you can make those updates from here. Same thing, then I would save, and then I would publish the form. In the event that this is a intake form, this is where you will now want to go back into your intake defaults. So from in here, what I'll want to do is I'll want to put in the new version on both the patient portal as well as in the patient's profile. But the original one that I had in there, which was this one actually, I will want to remove from the portal, but I still want it to be active in the profile. This way, practitioners and administrators can review that older form, just to, if we needed to do an update or review some information in there, then I still have access to it. But the patient now would have the ability to create that new form or fill in that new form with any updates that I've done from that as well. So from here, I would save that, and now when I go into a patient's profile, this one will no longer show, but this one will. Or on the portal. In the patient's profile on my side of the system, I'll still be able to see two. You could still potentially also send the old one via email. That option is still there. So just be aware that you're communicating with your team which versions they should be sending to patients. That is charts and intakes basically in a nutshell, the bare basics, a few tips and tricks that I have learned over the years in creating multiple forms for our clients. Like I said, we are currently in the process of revitalizing this entire system to make it a little more user friendly, put in some more new options for everyone to be able to create those forms for their patients and make it as easy as possible. Once that is done, we'll do a new video. If you do have any questions, please contact our support center at support@juvonno.com, and any one of our team would be more than happy to help you.